Welcome. Hopefully in the next couple of months as we're together, we'll all be catching up with each other and finding out where people are from. So what we'll do, how we're going to start is with a pattern. What's the word for this? Doug, you might need to help me out. We're
The
starting with
spiral.
the
It's called the
spiral.
spiral.
Thank you. The spiral, which is a pattern for engaging the world that God loves. And it comes from the wisdom of activist, environmentalist, wise woman, Joanna Macy. And it follows the good news of life, cross, resurrection that is basic to Christian conviction. So it's called the spiral, and it's 4 steps that help us engage wider creation with hopeful and creative action. And so I'm going to share with you the image now. 1 second, I'm going to screen share. Oh, yes. Here we go. This is the image that we're talking about. And it's a little bit blurry. I apologize for that. So this is what the spiral looks like. It has an entry point and an exit point. And the reason that it's a spiral is that this is a movement, an emotional, spiritual movement that we go through again and again in our lives, in our work. And Macy uses this to frame how we can carry on in times that are difficult and discouraging. And so what we'll do now is we will just take a few minutes to walk through the first 2 of these steps, and then we'll pay attention to the third and fourth later on in our time together this afternoon. So I'll leave that image in front of you just to walk us through it. So the first step is gratitude for creation. There's the roots of our dandelion. So expressing gratitude. The second is honoring our pain for the wounds of creation. The third is seeing with new eyes. And the fourth is going forth, moving into new action. And so we begin with gratitude. Psychologist Robert Emmons describes gratitude as a felt sense of wonder, thankfulness, and appreciation for life. So I just want to ask you all to take a minute. And I don't know how many things I can juggle on my screen here. I'm going to.
I just put the prompt down.
Did you put the prompt in the chat? Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so the prompt is in the chat, and we'll do this as a chat storm. So we'll take a minute, and there's a prompt that says, something I love about being alive on Earth is, I want you to write it in the chat, but don't press send for 1 minute. And then I'm going to say send, and we're all going to send it at the same time, and then we'll be able to see everyone's gratitude. So your minute starts now. Respond in the chat, but don't press send if you can help it.
And then I'll move to the second step, honoring our pain for the world. This is one that I at least feel like Americans sometimes are a little harder to do, but I think it's also part of the process of getting to where we need to be. It's recognizing that there's a problem. There's lots of reasons to stay in denial and pretend that there isn't. Some reasons is because it interrupts the way life is. We think it threatens our economic system. Others don't want to think about it just because we know how bad it is and just don't want to dwell there. So lament is a way of honoring our pain, and just to say too, it's honoring our pain. It's not wallowing in our pain, nor is it ignoring our pain, but it's honoring the pain and what it is telling us. So it's a way of, and then in biblical tradition, lament is a way to name our griefs. And I actually was planning to use the passage that Dan read from Jeremiah 4, which part of what I see there is, I think we talked about at the end of his time, is the way that there's this interconnection between human injustice and the creation. So Jeremiah 4, my people are fools, they don't even know me, says Yahweh. They are spoiled children, they do not understand. They are clever only in crime, they know nothing of goodness. I looked at the earth, and it was chaos and emptiness. I looked at the heavens, their light was gone. I looked to the mountains, they quaked, and the hills swayed back and forth. I looked, I saw no one, nothing. All the birds had flown away. I looked, the fertile land was desert, all its towns laid waste before Yahweh, before God's wrath. Sandy, do you have the next prompt ready to go?
Yep, I just put
Um,
it up there.
So, yeah, so think about how you would respond to that. I think I'll go ahead and say the first part of my prayer, and then we'll do another kind of, what did you call it? A chat storm?
Yeah.
But as you think about your response to that, I'm also going to just lead us in prayer. Christ, our wounded healer, who suffers the pains of creation, we lament that our abuse of creation has brought lasting damage to the world we have been given, polluting streams and soil, poisoning the air, altering the climate, and damaging the earth. We commit ourselves to honor all living things and to protect from abuse and extinction, for our world belongs to God. So I invite you to put your laments. Yeah, so I'd say go ahead and when you're ready. Yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing. Honestly, for honoring our pain. I'll close with a prayer. Christ, our wounded healer, who suffers the pains of creation, we are sorry. Help us. In your kindness and love, help us to live as your bearers of your image in a world you created for delight. We are sorry for how we have often harmed creation, causing climate disruption to all creatures. Forgive us our sins and the sins of our society. In your kindness, lead us to repentance. Empower us to follow our desires to change, creating us a clean heart, ready and willing to live your love on earth as it is in heaven. Amen. I think I'm going to end worship there, but just to say that we aren't, which is sort of odd. Usually I might say something to appease our sense of guilt a little bit more, but I think we're going to work at that in the coming hour and a half or so as we move into a way into those second two parts of the spiral, seeing with new eyes, which is sometimes also seen with ancient eyes, and then going forth. And we'll be working on projects for the last 40 minutes or so of our time together after Tim and I share. And that will be our going forth. Sandy, is there anything else?
Well, I think I just was going to introduce our next section. So when we started to dream about this cohort, the original title was Pastoral Care in the Climate Crisis. And as we began discussing with Tim and Claire and Yoel and Doug and myself in our planning committee, the name that emerged, Faithful Leadership in the Climate Crisis, emerged because we were recognizing that what we need is to figure out how to be leaders, and we need strong leaders to help do the work. And as Dan showed us this morning, to begin working at this new lens as a people of God. And the subtitle, Responding in Hope, was also really important. And we played around with what should go first, leadership or hope. And in the end, this is what we came up with. But we realized there's significant importance also to bringing the language of hope into our time together, into our work. So the presentation we'll have now from Doug and Tim will help us to think about spiritual care and leadership in the church in this time. So I would just hand it over to the two of you.
Thank you, Sandy. And this is in three parts. I'm going to be talking in this first section, and then we'll pause for a little discussion about emotional responses to climate change, some of the social psychology of climate change, and then we'll move into a section on pastoral response that I'll be bringing, and then Tim will be talking about leadership. So we have this spiritual care and leadership is one way to to think about this. Just a word about me is that I don't think I've said this yet, that I got started in this work by baptizing people in the Elkhart River. Sometimes it has too much manure for safe baptism. And so I became a Hoosier River Watch volunteer and worked with a group from my congregation, a citizen science kind of thing. But I also started reading the Bible differently and finding rivers to be a very important character in the biblical story. At least that's how I look at it. I don't know if Dan would agree with me on that, but in any case, it helped me to highlight how rivers are part of the story. And now I've been working with climate change, especially for the last 7 years or so. And just to kind of get started, and I think maybe I'll stop share to make it easier to see each other. Although then you don't see the question, do you? But how often do you talk about climate change? And let's put this in the chat: weekly, well, daily, weekly, or monthly, or less. And there's no shame, just put in chat what it is. And then also, if some of you would want to share why you think it is that you talk about it as often or as little as you do. And tell us first what you put in chat. So how often do you talk about climate change, and why do you think that is? And maybe I think it will work to keep sharing, huh? So weekly, almost daily, and yes, I teach about it. And of course, I'm daily as well. 4 times a week. Yeah, so say if someone wants to share a little bit, 2 to 4 times a week, about why you think it is as much or as little as you do. Just unmute yourself. No one?
Well, I'll just repeat what I wrote. I think I talk maybe 2, 3, 4 times a week about it, but frankly, I don't feel like I'm surrounded by people who A, care, and B, aren't a little worn out about hearing about it. And that's part of the reason why I'm here, frankly.
Yeah. One other person want to say something?
For me, it's usually sparked by something that's been said on the news, and then I might talk to my wife about it. As we're having breakfast or something, and yeah, it tends to be a reaction to that kind of kind of story that I've heard.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, and part of this builds on something that Per Espen Stoknes identified. He's a Norwegian psychologist that, as he looked over and this is about the last 40 years that he's examining, up to about 2015, I think. I don't quite remember the date now. This psychological paradox that in the North Atlantic countries, at least, Norway, Europe, North America, that as the climate science has become more convincing over time, it seems that people are less concerned. And I've sometimes had my doubts about this, and I thought that it was changing, but overall, it seems like it's continues to hold true. There was a time when it was moving up in the opinion polls in the U.S., and then it started to come back down as far as political priorities. But let me just show a couple of images of Canada, and these are climate surveys, climate opinion surveys and you might have to move move the screen. I'm not sure what view you have on, but this is a series of questions that the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication asked Canadians, and some areas didn't have enough. I think they just didn't have data that they could work with. And the redder the province, and this is by riding, by the way, the more people said yes, and bluer is no. So Earth is getting warmer. That's pretty strong throughout. But you'll notice that Alberta, I'll keep picking on Alberta actually, although we can mention southern Manitoba as well, a little less so. When the question becomes because of human activity, which is kind of the new focus of the debate, because the Earth getting warmer is becoming more and more evident. It's harder to deny that it's happening at all. This is kind of the next question: is human activity, is it the burning of fossil fuels? And you'll see there again that Alberta kind of stands out for being answering no the most. But Manitoba is not far behind. And then climate change will harm you personally. And there you see that when it gets to that question, most Canadians don't see much of a personal connection with climate change, or at least the personal harm that's going to happen. Again, Alberta the most. I think it's worth noting that Quebec is kind of in a different place than a lot of the country. And then there's a number of things, and this is from 2018. Sorry that they haven't updated it. This actually is a bit more yes, when it's my province has felt negative effects. So then people are a little more willing to see something. And then finally, do they support a tax on carbon-based fuels? And here it's also fairly low support. With Manitoba being one of the more supportive. And then because we have some Americans here, I decided to just add in one other opinion-oriented survey that this has to do with, this is again still the Yale program, and these are 6 segments of the population. Whether they're alarmed about climate change is the darkest. I guess is that green or whatever color that is on the left. And dismissive means they deny that it's happening. Doubtful is more like they don't think it's happening, but they're not like so anti. And you just see that the US and Canada are fairly similar to each other. These are from the top 15 emitters. So it's not in order of their emissions, it's in order of their opinions. Among the top 15, Mexico being the most concerned. And this doesn't include China, Russia, or Iran. I think I'll just pause there again and see if anyone has a question about that.
I just have a comment. I'm curious, especially given what I put, if some of those opinions have shifted since 2018, because in the time since then, we have had so much wildfire smoke in the summers. And I don't know if people are making that connection, but yeah, it certainly affects me a lot. And I feel like now I would say climate change affects me personally, which I wouldn't have said in 2018 necessarily.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And one reason why I don't know why they don't look at Canada more. And I had the same experience actually. I had experienced and we of course think of them as Canadian wildfires down here, but we're affected by them. And I was in Washington State experiencing it, and that was bad. But then when it hit Indiana, where I live, and I couldn't go outside for weeks, at least couldn't go biking without health. Yeah, it just really makes a different it just makes a difference.
But it'll also make more of a difference to someone like me who gets around everywhere on my bicycle than people who just go in their cars and hang out in their air-conditioned houses. So
Yeah, no, that's true too. Because yeah, as I say, it's because I couldn't go by. I felt that sense of not it being harder, and right, many people live in a hermetic seal. All right, if there's no other, you're gonna have to help me, Sandy, to see if somebody I guess put up your hand is the easiest thing because I think it goes up to me then.
Yeah.
All right. And then so part of trying to figure out what might be going on with this social science data, that some of the people who are most involved in creating the problem of climate change, why are they not seeing it more, comes from the work of Kari Norgaard, who's an American sociologist who spent a year in a small town in Norway. And they had the warmest winter in 130 years. And this is again about 10 years ago or something like that. And what she noticed, and she didn't tell people that she was there to study climate change, she just was in conversation with people, is that climate change was hardly ever mentioned as the cause of this warm winter. And Norwegians are folks who tend to think of themselves as environmentalists, as international, supporting international justice, human rights, and also love wilderness. They love to ski. Like the little town where she lived, they had to drive like 2 hours north for their ski team to practice because they didn't have snow like they normally would. And so she developed this ideas around, well, first of all, just that for Norwegians, they had been trying to distance themselves from it, but the bigger part, this slide I came to early. The part of the problem for Norwegians is that they also make a lot of money from oil. And so it brought up this sort of moral dissonance for them, that they were creating this problem and they didn't really want to talk about their moral culpability. Now, many of us in North America, we distance ourselves from climate change, saying it's in the future or it's in other places. We don't have to worry about it as much. There's a sense in which climate change is invisible because it's just the air. It's personally distant, and also this socially and locus of control aspect. A lot of the people in this meeting, we don't actually don't feel like we have many ways of doing something about it. We're not large corporation. We don't run large corporations. We're not setting transportation policy for our countries. There's some ways in which we just feel distant, and many of us, I would guess, both feel distant from the wealthy and more powerful who could do something about it, but also many of us feel distant from the poor and the less powerful who are probably most affected by it. And so Norgaard came up with this broader idea of different kinds of denial that was at work in Norway. Really, there wasn't much of this first denial, which is what we usually think of, where we refute the facts, and not a lot of even interpretive denial. And those are the folks who do say, well, climate change is happening, but it's not because of human actions. An example of interpretive denial would come from it's the idea where you say, yes, that's happening, but it's not what you think it is. You might say, well, I'm a social drinker, not an alcoholic. But she says that she thinks implicatory denial was the denial happening most in Norway, which is accepting of the facts. Yes, it's happening, but ignoring the psychological, political, and moral implications. Because it's so hard to continue to live with those all the time, we just kind of let it go. It's a little bit like if a parent or a grandparent is aging, and we can see their decline, but we try to ignore it because it's too difficult to deal with. Now, I noticed that as I've taken her ideas and applied it as I've read the Bible, I've noticed that denial is actually something that the prophets talk about. Jesus actually quotes this idea from Isaiah 6. We have this beautiful calling of Isaiah, where he experiences the presence of God. And then God says, go and say to this people, listen, but do not discern, look, but do not understand. So this idea of how can they turn and be healed? It's as if God is keeping people from seeing. And Isaiah asks, how long? And God says, until cities lie waste without inhabitant. And this fear I have that's the kind of experience that we are going through. And let me just double check here. Yeah. Okay, let's go back. Oh, my computer. So here are some of my suggestions about some of the emotions that are going on as that denial keeps us from seeing. The sense of helplessness, that there's not much I can do about it, a sense of guilt that we're contributing to it. Grief is often unexpressed. Fear, it's just scary images. Someone mentioned this in your talk, as you were talking about why you're here, this sense of partly that we have too many fearful images. And then I've actually I no longer think that we should think of one side as helpful emotions and the other side as negative, as ones that keep us from engaging climate. I think all the emotions, if we express them, can get us to a place where we're addressing it. But some of the emotions that have been found to help the most with engaging climate change are things like hope, a sense of hope, a sense of purpose. They find that if you're talking to children and you don't want them to feel hopeless, it's helpful to talk to them about people who are doing something about it, how they can be have a sense of purpose in doing something about it. Anger is an emotion that I used to put on the troubling side because I grew up Mennonite and anger is bad, but actually anger can help fuel engagement on climate. So I think, Sandy, you're going to have to help me know how much time we have. Have I already used about all my time? I think
We're 20 minutes into
we're
your
20 minutes into my time. Okay.
hour. Yeah.
Well, I think I'm going to again just, yeah, I still want to give just a little bit of time to what are your feelings about climate change? And I think I was going to have a split into small groups, but I think it'd be better just to talk as a group if anyone's willing to share a little bit about your emotions around climate change. And just unmute yourself. Or put it in chat if that's easier for you.
It's ironic, as a psychologist, I often feel bipolar because I get really excited. For example, as I mentioned earlier, I was probably one of the early adopters of buying an electric car. I have a Tesla. So I was really excited about it, but then I went up north and discovered how much damage our hydro dams are doing. So you've got that tug, right? And trying to find a way between that. And it has direct impact on our family, the people around me, as I tell my stories. And what I've discovered is very helpful is to share and do together with other people rather than doing it alone, and then just staying with either one of those two extremes, finding a middle way between that. And one really cool story is that I happened to be at one of an ice cream hut. I had my Tesla there, was enjoying the summer day, and an Indigenous gentleman came up to me and marveled at my electric car, asked me a number of questions about it. And I apologetically said how much damage it was doing. He looked at me, he said, "Sir, you're on the right track. Don't worry about that part. Continue working toward how to move forward." And to me, that was so inspirational to hear that.
Yeah, no, that is an inspirational story. Thank you for sharing that, Dieter. And I also have an electric car and I'm aware of the mining practices that also go into, I mean, that's another thing that's come up is the mining practices. But I think the image I'll want to continue to use is just taking the next step, and trying to, like, we've moved to having one car rather than two. And yeah, anyway, there's just different things. And then, and I'm assuming Mennonite Church Alberta is Tim. I don't know, Tim, you might change your your name, but yeah, it feels like a disorienting. Yeah, it feels like a disorienting time with Trump's direction in the U.S. and also the pushback to climate initiatives in Canadian politics. Yeah, and that's a major issue for me right now, having friends in the climate movement who've had their millions of dollars in funding told that they're frozen for now. We don't know the outcome for sure. For planting trees is what they were going to do with the money. Joanne?
I was gonna say, as someone who's been in this work for a long time, I feel grief and I feel fear, but I also have this long-standing, just like stubborn persistence. I feel like that's kind of my overwhelming emotion is I don't care if it's bad news, I'm just gonna keep going.
I have not heard stubborn persistence yet, but I like that, and I think I'll write that down.
And the other one I would put in there that's sort of in the same grouping is defiant hope.
Yeah, that's a good one too. Maybe one other person, and then we'll move ahead.
If I may share, in having conversations with congregants lately, like, I mean, the word overwhelmed has come up a lot the last 2 weeks, not just about the climate crisis, but generally with how the world is right now. But I like the word purpose, and I feel like that's related, like in conversations, like it's overwhelming, just like what are all the things we could be doing, but then that kind of purposefully um just trying to realize what can we do in our corner of the world. And yeah, I've had some good conversations outside the climate conversation as well, but I really like, yeah, thinking of it as a sort of finding our purpose in this conversation and direction. Maybe purpose and direction are kind of synonymous in my head right now, but just finding direction, because it all is way too much and we can only do so much, and that's where despair comes in. But when we hone in on our little pockets, our churches, our communities, I feel like when I think of it in smaller terms, I guess, I feel more hope and more, yeah, direction, I guess. When you're looking at the big picture, it can easily get like, I don't know, I shut down and then I think I can't do anything, but that doesn't help either. So yeah, I like the word purpose on this list.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisi. And one thing to say about this list, I mean, this is just a list I put together from different studies. There's lots of other words that one could use related or unrelated. And yeah, so I think it's worth thinking about our emotional response and being able to articulate it, because I think that helps us get a little deeper into what God is doing in our lives. Okay, I'm going to move on. And I think, so I have 15 more minutes, I think is the idea that from what Sandy was telling me. So the next section here, and let me get is thinking a little bit. So the first half I was talking kind of about the problematic aspect, and here we look at pastoral and spiritual responses. In particular, I go to first just a couple of spiritual resources from the past. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote about the problem of denial in his letter from a Birmingham jail, because he was writing to moderate white pastors who were telling him he's pushing too hard. And maybe I'll just let you read that. Well, partly the second part, human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of people willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. I think a lot of more progressive folk tend to think that future is about progress, and just to realize that his point is it can go either way. And I think we're seeing that in a way. And so there could be regression rather than progression. And then looking specifically biblically at this denial theme in Isaiah, because there's actually several passages in Isaiah, there's three main parts. And so here in this second section of Isaiah, where the calling is to open the eyes. So yes, at one point there was the suffering that came and the being taken from the land, which I think it's maybe important to see how the land is such a central image in some of these biblical and prophetic writings. But afterwards, the call to the prophet is to open the eyes of people. So there are these 5 ways that I think resources that we have as congregations to work at climate change. I'm going to go into each of these just a little bit. communal. Bifocal is again this question of, yes, climate change is in some ways about a bad news future, but how do we integrate good news? How do we keep our eyes on both aspects? Ritual, I think, is an important part of working at this, and solidarity, and then climate justice advocacy and activism. So the communal part is just that, one thing that is troubling for many people is that, what can I as one individual do about this? And it may feel that way, that even with your congregation, you're not very powerful, but you are more powerful. And I think about in our context where we, a lot of our electricity comes from coal. I mean, it's interesting, the different, hydro is a one of those difficult issues, because I'm aware as a river guy how destructive they are of ecosystems, but it's also true that they don't contribute to climate change, except for the cement that's used. So anyway, I'm in a congregation that put up solar panels a while ago as an alternative to coal, and that's something that we could do together that's a little harder to do individually. And also just, the ways that when one person adopts an electric car, like I sold my old electric vehicle to someone in my church, and then we slowly, as we see people doing things, there's just all these ways that you can get a good cycle through communal action, and also just have a bigger impact in your community. Bifocal spirituality. How do we remember both the good news and the bad news and keep our eyes on both? That yes, there's climate disasters that are coming, but if we work at this, if we have less coal, we're talking about better lives, cleaner air, better mental health when we have forests nearby. And I see in this bifocal good news and bad news, the basic gospel of the life of Jesus, but the cross and the resurrection. And someone that I go to, and it's maybe helpful to have Dan Epteson's teaching in mind as I talk about Hans Hut and his Gospel of All Creatures, which was a teaching that appears in Anabaptism just a year into it. And I think what I would say that what I am doing by highlighting Hans Hut is trying to work at recovery, because the Anabaptist tradition more often is complicit in the development of industrial agriculture and in an industrialized world. I shouldn't just bring up agriculture, and even in colonialism. I mean, we were very much a part of both the British Empire and the Russian Empire's taking of lands from indigenous people. So there's this voice here, this Hans Hut, that's a kind of minority report, we might say, and something that I want to highlight. And it's not that I agree with everything that he says about our relationship with the other creatures, but what I appreciate is that he does see the gospel at work in the creatures and for all creatures and with all creatures. That his point is that the crucifixion isn't something that just happened back there, in Jesus, but it has continuing implications for us in our lives, and not just in our lives as humans, but in all creatures, so that Christ in all his members, so all creatures are members of Christ. The whole Christ suffers in all members. And an image for me that has been powerful is this, the front of the Mennonite congregation in Jepara, Indonesia. It's in the shape, that distinctive shape is the Gunungan, the way they think about the cosmos. And so the cross there with water buffalo, jaguars, snakes. The cross itself is a tree. And then I think rituals are a particular gift that we have. I think it's underutilized. We mostly think about it in terms of funerals. And I would encourage us to think about having rituals and in our churches that help us to engage the wider world. When the US EPA made a decision about, I think there were 23 endangered species that they said, look, they're extinct. We haven't seen them for decades. Our congregation named all those species that were extinct. We grieved that loss. And I think this idea of disenfranchised grief is that it's like an example of a disenfranchised grief would be someone who has a miscarriage, and we don't really have a public way, and we don't really know what to say to acknowledge that. And that's often for those of us who maybe experienced the loss of a place that was important to us. Imagine if you had grown up in the tar sands of Alberta, for example, and your home is destroyed in that way. So it helps us to move from a disenfranchised to an acknowledged grief. And then here again is this spiral that we were talking about, with beginning in gratitude, honoring our pain. I think those two movements that we already went through are critical. And then seeing with new eyes, which is, I think, when we are both in gratitude and honoring our pain, I think it helps us to see things in a new way and to think of what our next step is. And it's a spiral, meaning that it keeps moving ahead as well. Solidarity. As a church, we see ourselves as a global community. There are global impacts of climate change. And so this can help us to notice that our brothers and sisters in sub-Saharan Africa are experiencing huge droughts that are making it very difficult. And so we can hopefully care more about these things that are happening. I think this solidarity goes across race, it goes across religion, and I think it also goes across species. And I don't think we have time to go very deeply into this, but just to note that the countries that are contributing the most, have the highest emissions, are also so the top, who is most involved in creating the problem, the bottom is who is the most vulnerable, with the red sections most vulnerable. This again, unfortunately, is 2011. I would think that China would be a darker, would be in the red by now. And then advocacy and activism. So congregations can be places that help us to do this. I know it depends on the congregation, but we need to be advocating at broader levels. It's not just what I do. It's not just what my church does. How can we be advocating for climate justice, advocating for those on the front line? And here I just have an image of me with my senator from Indiana, Todd Young. And I think I need to stop there. Project Drawdown, I recommend, is one place to find solutions as we move towards that. But I think, Sandy, that my time is up, right?
If you were taking 40 minutes, then you would have another few, but I'm not sure how you and Tim were divided.
Yeah, well, I was well, Tim should have 20 more minutes.
Yeah, so he can go till 2:15.
Okay, so we have another 4 minutes, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, good. So I just again wanted to pause for questions and
Mhm.
comments, and
I would love to have some access to some resources where, like, I'm not even sure that I know what a current list is or when there are changes in the list of species that are lost, and then other ideas about rituals, other ideas about, I mean, some of the prayers that we heard today. I know there's some in Voices Together, but it would be nice to have, in general, an idea about some resources that maybe I'm not currently aware of.
yeah, so I've happened to learn a lot about endangered species because whenever I go to a new location, I just Google it, Dan, at the state level, or I mean, in Indiana, I've done it to the county level. I'm not sure that that's always the case. And some of the weirdest places don't have it organized very well, like Maine. I had to look in several different websites because I think their marine mammals is marine animals is one place, and you also have to decide if you include plants, and what all do you include. But in general, I just Google it, the state and endangered species, and most states. And I don't have experience with provinces. I was hoping, well, Wendy was going to take care of this. We were going to do some of these rituals at the in-person event. We might bring Wendy to do some of them, but I also can help with that as well. We'll try to. Sandy is taking notes about that. Any other questions or comments? We have a couple more minutes.
Doug, the opening statement sounds counterintuitive to me. As science becomes more convincing, people become less concerned. Can you expand upon that?
So, and I don't know how many people read the Panu Pikala article that we sent. It's more of an academic article. In some ways, I like the way he frames it, is that in some ways it's so scary that we don't care about it. Like, or it's just too, it's too scary to think about. And so people just pretend like it's not happening. Or who just told the story about the Oklahoma senator? There's this famous Oklahoma senator for bringing in the snowball. He believed climate change was happening until he heard the cost of it, and now he's a climate denier. So to me, it's partly this confrontation of self-deception and that the human is not as good as we like to think we are, and that we rationalize our behavior, that the kind of, as people learn the kind of change that we need to go through, it's just too difficult. And the thing is, Jason, I thought things were changing. Like I was watching the polling in the US and climate change was going up. And interestingly enough, the last time climate change went from the bottom of political priorities all the way to the middle, which isn't much, but it's the best I've ever seen it. That happened to be at the end of the Trump administration, like right before the Trump administration ended. That part doesn't answer your question, but it is, but it is just it is a part of what I'm saying is, unfortunately, the hopeful part is those surveys that Yale does. I would say they are, more and more people are becoming convinced. The dismissive and the doubtful is getting to be a smaller group, and the alarmed and the concerned is getting to be a larger group. So it could be that Stokeness is wrong about that, and that it's finally turning. But it's amazing to me how you keep thinking, well, won't this get people convinced? Like the fires in LA. Well, no, it wasn't climate change. It was Governor Newsom that caused it. So there's just, yeah, it's just people are wily. I don't know if that answered your question, but now I have to turn it over to Tim anyway, and I can get out of it.
Well, sure, I can jump in here and well, first off, I'll say I live in Edmonton, which is one of those places on the maps that always had the worst kind of record according to its opinion on climate and things like that. And one thing I've observed is that when people mobilize towards acting on climate, there's that inevitable pushback that comes, and it's often led by interest groups or industry or political voices. And once those voices give people an out, a way to talk about it that allows them to be dismissive, I think that's extra challenging. I'll introduce myself a little bit. Just I have my role as executive minister of Mennonite Church Alberta, and so I work with the congregations of MCA that are in Alberta and also across Canada. So creation care is not central to my role, but my role does let me dabble in it and as I think I said in my first introduction earlier, I am looking for ways to draw it further to the center. Because I have had a long interest in creation care, and I've gone into two distinct areas of study to think about that. Back in 1994, I did a master's thesis that was about Mennonite environmental theology. And at that point, the debate was, is can a Christian perspective ever include caring for creation? Because it was more like it was overwhelmingly to blame for the problems that we were having with creation by comments like Genesis 1 and dominion and other types of things. But I think that overall we feel that Christianity has a positive role to play. That's why we're kind of here in this group. The other area of study is a completely kind of different area. In 2020, I completed a Master of Environment and Business degree from the University of Waterloo. And that is a program that brings together two things that we don't normally think about when we think about area of study. Environment and business are usually in conflict with each other, but this was one of trying to put these things together. And myself, I've also thought, how might I bring the theological and practical environment, business, belief, look for ways to bring these together? Because I think that when we look at the challenge of climate change and general creation care, these areas need to at least inform each other, and we're not going to solve this problem unless we start to bring some things together. And I do want to share my screen, so I wonder if I'm allowed to do that. I will send a request. And now I can.
Yes, sorry, I should have made you co-host.
Oh, no problem. Yeah. So now I just have to put my things around so I can see what I need to see when I need to see it. Right. All right, so I think we've likely seen graphs like this at times. It's this hockey stick line graphs that talk about the trajectory that we're on when we think about impacts on the environment. And I think it's sort of a way of saying, like, this problem that we're in an exponentially troubling zone where every system on Earth is being affected by things that are getting put out of whack. And we are on a trajectory that is leading to some pretty dire futures. And it's going to take a lot to turn this trajectory around. When I think about this, I often think about the ship analogy, where we're heading towards rocks, and that ship can't turn on a dime. But it can be turned. So how do we think about the steps needed to be turning this kind of trajectory? This is a truck I saw near my house, and it's not quite the answer I think we can really go for, just to tape up our gas tank and say we're not going to worry about burning fossil fuels immediately, because it's going to take some time and transition time. You can't just run the same truck by just taping over our gas cans. And I also love this comic because it has this tension that you've got revolution now on the one hand, and small incremental change that a time that's convenient. Neither one is quite the right answer. So so how do we live into being the people God is calling us to be in ways that make a real practical and measurable difference? So I'd like to share a few things that come out of some of my studies, particularly out of my master's in environment and business program. So I think I did find some handles that feel promising, and even just ways of articulating some of the leadership principles that may be helpful as we move into this next phase of this leadership program. First is the importance of leadership itself. As part of my coursework, our capstone project with the group was about healthcare, and we were examining healthcare systems. We had a hospital that we were working with that was looking to ask how might they improve their environmental impacts. There's there's studies that show that within the North American healthcare system, the emissions from the healthcare industry in 1 year results in nearly 500,000 lost years of health. Like, that's how long people's lives are shortened, or at least their healthy lives are shortened, like the resulting illnesses or disabilities or premature deaths because of what the system emits. And so you've got this motto in healthcare, do no harm, but you've got a system itself that is causing all kinds of harm that we can actually measure. And so a number of studies have looked at the different impacts of hospitals, or different types of impacts and emissions, like whether it's emissions like just general waste produced or greenhouse gas. And the biggest difference was in leadership. Like the metrics that related to leadership made a difference. So if you had less impact, if less impact is your goal, if you want to have less impact in negative ways, then the leadership is going to make a difference to what the results are. And this slide shows some of the ways in which leadership does make a difference. You've got leadership showing a commitment to sustainability or action regarding environmental impacts. That shows that leaders have bought into the idea of not only financial sustainability, but the long-term health of the environment and people as being part of the commitment that needs to happen. Allocating of resources, like how are you putting energy into the steps that you want to take, and outlining what those steps are, like what are the steps that are going to lead to change. And these other three were important as well: networking, developing frameworks and policies, and creating a green culture. But the first three are really the ones that were the most impactful when they measured how leadership was approaching sustainability and practice. So I'd like to look at these first three and how they play into an area of leadership, particularly as we think about that within church settings. So first off here, we've got commitment to action. And in the church, we might call this living into our calling, or we might say practice what you preach. In business, they would call it vision what you want to become and the goals that you're aiming for. And we've probably all heard a version of this quote somewhere. If we truly feel that we are called to care for creation and to address climate change, we need to make choices and set goals that demonstrate that this is where we want to go. We know that the way we live in our society is damaging our world. So we need to be able to articulate the goals that we will use to make our decisions. What are the considerations that we want to put into place? Within the sustainability movement in the secular world, I often use a Venn diagram, something like this. It outlines the three big pillars of economics, environment, and social systems. And to become truly sustainable means aiming for that sweet spot where the long-term viability of all three intersect. In business, sometimes it feels like money is the only goal. It's the only driver of decisions. And I could talk about that being a lot of the reaction to climate change discussions in Alberta, is because so much is tied to the oil and gas industry. And so we've got ads from oil and gas industry saying that we're all going to be worse off if we don't have a healthy oil and gas industry, which means basically unfettered support for it. And these type of things or considerations aren't just a problem with business, like how many churches make decisions based on the budget, or at least it feels like that at times. And economics are important. Even in the nonprofit, if the economics aren't sustainable, you can't keep going. But focusing on any one of these areas quickly leads to problems. It can be problems for the environment, problems for people, and ultimately the economic problems that come from damage to those systems as well. So not only is our society often focused on the economic bubble solely, it's also tended to focus short term, and sustainability recognizes the need to take into consideration not only current generations, but future generations as well. So if there was one key takeaway I had from my master's program, is that there are viable ways of living that not only take into account the short-term economics, but also are sustainable for creation and community. And ultimately, that makes them economically sustainable in the long run. So much is a matter of what criteria we allow to be part of our decision-making process. And that happens on the macro level when you think about overall society, and to some extent on the micro level of individuals and groups. Certainly within any group or individual, there's differences of power. Some have more power to affect choices that would make a difference, or the type of choice that they can make, or their influence over other levels of decision makers. All these things, though, can be part of the decision-making choices that we are at least able to make. So I'm just going to stop for a moment just to get a couple minutes of feedback. Does this make sense to you? What circles would you add, or what would you subtract? Any feedback on this type of goal-setting exercise that puts things like this together? Just shout out if you got a response. I'm muting.
Tim, what about the whole area of spirituality? When I watch my Indigenous brothers and sisters, that's such a big part of this.
Yeah, and I think that is something that I would say as a church, we bring that lens into this type of diagram, asking where is the spiritual connection. One thing that I found really fascinating is that I learned aspects of Indigenous spirituality, then I hear things that sound a lot like a secular language, but through a spiritual lens, like a comment about thinking of myself as having considering 7 generations backward and 7 generations forward as I make my choices and decisions, I'm going, well, yeah, that's a bit about the sustainability language of considering future generations and seeing yourself as part of this narrative. So yeah, that's like, I think when I look at approaching this, I would put that spiritual lens over the whole package.
I have a colleague who's the dean of our business school, but used to teach environmental studies alongside me, and he's working at making images for this and trying to integrate spirituality into it. And I think he's at a tetrahedron now. It started as a triangle and now it's gone 3 dimensions. Every time he explains it, it has a different shape slightly. So I think it's going to turn into a book someday. But I guess the other thing that I would say, and I don't know, maybe you and I have had arguments about this before, Tim, but I actually don't like this particular way of putting these together because I feel like, well, it often turns into the economy being everything and the other two sort of, as you said, but also it sort of gives us this idea that there are kind of 3 things that can have parts that are separate from each other, but actually the economy is embedded in society and society is embedded in the environment. So it almost, like the way I would draw it, is environment as a big circle, society as a circle within it, and economy as a circle within that. So that's just another way of picturing it.
Right. Yeah. I appreciate that. And that's, I think the way we picture may influences how we think about things. So that is a helpful aspect. Mark, one quick comment and then I
yeah, I mean, Joanne said what I what I wanted to say as well, that this is good for business to think about things within capitalism, but within bigger reality, I think we have to acknowledge that the economy depends on society, which depends on the environment. But I mean, the other piece is that, under the way that we have things set up at the moment, the job of a corporation is to make profits for its shareholders. It's not to do all the other really good things, much better things that we want the business to do. And so how do we combat that?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a valid comment. And I think the key piece, I didn't want to stop sharing, but the key piece is, I think that how do we incorporate goals into our decision-making process? And while we still live within a system that needs transformation, how do we push through our choices and have lenses that allow us to do that? So defining goals is a lot of what leadership needs to be working on, and asking ourselves, what are the ways in which we're looking to bring things together? We obviously live in a system that is capitalist at the moment. So within this system, what do we need to push in terms of change, in terms of the goals that we set? The second area is, I'm just going to flip through this quickly, is the allocating of resources. I'm not sure this is the best quote, but it is true that where we devote a lot of our time and money or energy reflects the results that we'll get. And certainly it says something about what we think is important or crucial. And when you think about leadership, it is about making choices. It is about assessing needs. It's about setting priorities. It's about monitoring progress, and it's about reflecting and adapting. So it's certainly, when I think about leadership, I think about setting goals. It's like, what are we going to need to reach those goals? What is the priorities that need to be given? And a third important task is steps leading to change. So what will move in a more sustainable direction? What will move the rudder of the ship that we're on, even just a little, so that we're moving more towards the direction that we'd like to see? I'd like to give a quick example of effective leadership, and this is a company called Interface, commercial carpeting company. And in 1994, they made the commitment to eliminate their negative environmental emissions by 2020. So becoming carbon neutral. And so they had a variety of strategies that they used, reducing waste, doing tile carpeting so you could replace just parts that wore out, focusing on renewable energy. And by 2019, actually 1 year early, they had achieved their goal. The thing is, they didn't achieve this goal all at once. Back when the idea was first introduced, the idea of a carpet company that could be even carbon neutral, it was something that felt like an impossibility. So their CEO at that time described it as a commitment to climb Mount sustainability, and they saw it as getting to the top of Mount Everest, that kind of analogy. So it was, how do you set goals for along the way? How do you make sure you have the needed support and supplies, that you outline the strategy, make the plans, and also recognize that you can only climb a mountain one step at a time. So now Interface has become carbon neutral, and they've actually got tiles that they see as being carbon negative, taking more carbon out of the system than adding into it. And are looking at other ways in which they are a company that looks to weave sustainability through all that they do. So I wonder a bit about what if we had a mountain like that for the church? What would we see as a mountain to climb? I know Sandy, my time is getting close to up, isn't it? One thing I wanted to,
You have 4 minutes. Go for it.
one thing I wanted to mention here was just some of the inspirations I have from biblical leaders. I think about Moses, the reluctant, spirit-led, visionary person who had this idea of a promised land, but it had to be an incremental kind of movement, and like a spirit-led the whole way, and also community-based, being brought in. And so you have Moses as someone who spoke truth to power and became a catalyst for a movement of the marginalized. I've got Elijah, who is a powerful person, but also a persecuted and isolated person who flees for his life and feels he's totally alone, but God reminds him that there are still 7,000 in Israel who are faithful, even if he hadn't noticed them. Or you have Esther, who was an exceptional person, obviously won a beauty contest, got to be in a position of power, and then used her power to make a difference. Even though within that she had limits, she had to be resourceful and diplomatic. Peter, who's impulsive, not perfect, brash and timid in interesting ways, faithful and fearful, and yet grew to be the rock upon which Jesus built the church. Or Mary Magdalene, who is, I see in her persistence and passion and being present at the tomb, and that allowed her to be among those who first saw the risen Christ. I want to just end with a couple of little quotes from Leah Reeser-Keller, who's a transitional executive director of Kairos. This is something that she spoke at a podcast about a month ago that I saw. So what I have come to believe is that the only way forward is by cultivating a gritty, grounded kind of hope, one that looks clear at the challenges and is willing to take the next step and the next, and to act in accordance with our values, regardless of whether the outcome seems fixed. And to me, that's a bit of the Mary Magdalene kind of waiting at the tomb. You don't see the hope, but that puts you in a position where you can actually witness to the risen Christ when that miracle happens. And I had a few different ways in which we can become involved in things within a structural way. I lead a Many Church Canada Sustainability Leadership Group. As one thing, there's a God Green Church thing that talks about how churches can get started, and it starts with working on leadership. How do you put together a group that is going to be leading in a congregation? So that's a resource that can be used. And then just to conclude with, back to Leah again, she talked a bit about some of the ways that I think when you think about Venn diagrams, these are ways in which she's adding some lenses which I think are helpful from a Christian context. So living into our values in big and with big and small choices, imagining and living the world we want into being, living in hope and overcoming despair, having the courage to take steps toward what could be. So living in a way that centers on community, care, and love. Grieve as an experience of love for what was, what has been, and what could have been, and what could yet be. Transforming our pain and suffering into joy through love. So love being a kind of a lens for her. Live in love that imagines a world of transformed relationships because it is giving life, not just to fight climate change. And I think that's the ultimate challenge, is how do we point people to the good life that we know is there for us, not because it'll save the world or creation, but because it's such a good way to live. Anyway, that's don't have much time for questions, but
You can take a
hopefully,
few comments, take a comment or two.
yeah, any response or thoughts?
I have a question. I think I also actually studied environment at Waterloo a little while ago. And yeah, I mean, when I was there, all the talk was about sustainability, sustainable development, and you know, kind of some limits to that term. But now that I'm kind of re-immersing myself in this work, I'm hearing the word like regeneration used a lot more. And I'm just wondering, like in the context of your environment and business program, maybe how, if that was talked about, and, or if anyone else has feedback on some of the differences between those frames of thinking. And specifically, I'm thinking about like the mountain metaphor, but how, you know, we're also experiencing climate change as something that we need to continuously be adapting as well. So it's not just this kind of monolith to climb, but almost like a stormy sea.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, if that makes sense. So in terms of goal setting, like we don't even necessarily know all the things that are coming. So thinking more about building resilience or an adaptive resilience. I don't know if you can speak to that. Sorry, it's a very messy kind of question.
I appreciate that. And I think that there's a lot of validity in that. Like I took this program between 2017 and 2020, and my impression is it was towards the end of a trajectory of kind of the curriculum that had been developed, and some growing realization that some of the things that were being presented were starting to no longer be of service in the same way that we might have hoped. And one of them is that sustainability is kind of a term that's been co-opted primarily financially, and so that's what people think of right away. The comments about the Venn diagrams and how they might give a perception of the possibility of existing outside of is something which is a valid question. I think for myself, I see it as, if I'm only thinking of one of those, it is possible to only think of one. It is possible that you're not even considering the other. The challenge is that leads to huge problems. What I do remember from the course that was positive, and what you talked about, is two things in particular. One is the resilience conversation that was sort of a newer growing element, and the other was the need to move out of silos. And I think that was the big push of a Venn diagram kind of idea, is that these are silos, and now that we need to move into that center place. And I appreciate also then what you said about regeneration, because I think we're recognizing that we're not just in a phase of impacting the environment. We already have impacted. So how do we move back from and heal? So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Tim and Doug, for sharing insights and wisdom and challenging us in good ways to think and to see what's next. We are going to move into our next section, which is our introduction to the project and discussion. And so, as you know, one of the components of this course is the project aspect. And so Doug is going to guide us into what we need to do between now and our next meeting on that, how to get started. So Doug, I invite you on screen to, get us going on that discussion, wherever you are.
And I'll first of all, I'll direct you to the document that Sandy sent. Was that this morning that you sent it from Joanna Macy?
Yeah, I sent an email with a document, and if anyone didn't get those questions, maybe I'll just put a little note in the chat, and I can try to get those questions to you if you weren't able to.
And I'll go ahead and share my screen too, where I have it as a slideshow. But just so you know that these questions are also in that document. And again, this comes from Joanna Macy, and we think of this project that we're asking you to, I guess, complete or at least have made good steps on it by July. And this is something that she's developed, that Joanna Macy has developed, that I think is a very helpful way of thinking this through. You know, question number 1 is the broader question, which you maybe do want to answer or wouldn't have to, but you know, what is kind of what's your bigger picture thing that you're headed towards? I'm asking you to specify connected to your congregation, or if you're not as connected to congregational leadership, then within your community. And then what specific goal or project could you realistically aim to achieve? I guess we have the next 12 months. In some ways, we're saying the next 6 months, right? Or 5 months.
Yeah, we're sort of aiming for summer.
Yeah. Now, just to say, what we're about to do, we're going to break into groups of 2 to help you work at this. And this is kind of the time frame. I narrowed it down just a little bit, Sandy, down to 35 minutes. That we would suggest that you spend 10 minutes, you know, looking at these. You know, I think you want to focus on questions 1, 2, and 7, perhaps. I mean, see how much time you have. And then we have you divided into pairs. If you're kind of from the same region, which sometimes is very broadly speaking, you're together. Make sure each person gets 10 minutes to talk about what they're thinking, and then just and to not just to talk, but to give the other person time to ask some questions about the project that you're thinking, and then another 5 minutes to write some more is the idea. So I think part of what's helpful about this are the resources that she suggests we think about, the inner and outer resources that we have to do. With inner resources, you know, being your experiences, your knowledge, your skills, what strengths you know of that you have. And then external resources might have to do with the networks that you have, the relationships, but it also could do with, you know, how much money you have or how much influence you have in the community or in a business. So what do you already have to help you? What will you need to acquire, including what you might need to develop or learn? And then how might you stop yourself? What are obstacles and how might you overcome them? And then I think number 7 is just critical. What could you do in the next week to move you towards this goal? I think one thing I would say too is that we recognize that if you are implementing something in your congregation, that a very important step, but before we meet in March, is for you to have talked to people. So it's not just something that you're thinking, but that you're starting to ask people about what they might be interested in. So that would be one of the more important things I think on here, and a step you might take in the next week is to make sure you talk to someone who might be part of the project that you're thinking about. So those are the questions. Again, I'll just go to the time frame. I think what we'll do is when we have it sorted here, we'll give you 10 minutes where we stay in the group, and you can take time to write in that document that Sandy has, or write by hand, whatever your preference is. Some of your reflections, some of your thoughts about these things. Then we'll break into the pairs for 20 minutes, and we'll send a reminder at the 10-minute point, or maybe at the 9-minute point, to remind you to switch to the other person in a minute, and then give another silent time, and then we are planning to come back together for Sandy to send us off with a few hopeful words. So yeah, any questions? That seems to make sense. All right, should we go ahead and get started? So I'd say we will regather at 3:38 or 2:38 or 1:38 or 12:38 for breaking you into groups, into partners.
So people can just shut their screen off if they want to, and then.
Yeah.
Okay. Just a final word about the conversations you just had. Our hope is that when we gather in March, and the date is, I'll grab the date for you in a sec. When we gather in March, our hope would be that you have some idea of what your project is. So you've got the foundations now to start thinking about that. And when we get together, we'll take some time. It's March 5th from 10 to 12 Central Time and 10 a.m. Central Time, March 5th. So we'll have some time in pairs. If your partner from today is with us again that day, you'll be paired with them or you'll be paired with someone else. But to continue the conversation about these projects that will happen in March when we're together. There will probably be others joining kind of in and out through our flow, but hopefully you'll find some consistency for your project. We wanted to end just with one more word on hope, and I was grateful that Tim brought up the Leah Reeser Keller quote, and he's put in the chat a quote or a link to New Leaf Ministries where you can actually see a recording of the conversation that he heard from Leah. It wasn't a podcast. So feel free to click that link and check that out later.
Yeah, just to clarify, I don't know if you can actually get the recording. You may need to contact New Leaf Network and say, this is what I want. How do I access it?
Yeah. And you might have to pay because it's a bit of a subscriber service, I think.
$10 kind of thing.
Yeah. So just to wrap up, we talked about hope a little bit, and our subtitle is Responding in Hope. And as we've seen today, hope is used in many ways, the word, but we want to leave you with an invitation to think about what responding in hope might mean for you and the people that you walk with. I like to understand hope as a way of life. It's not blind optimism. It's not naivete. Hope can't be dependent on success. As Leah's quote said, it can't be that I'm only hopeful if what I want to happen happens, because then our hope runs out really fast because things don't go as we expect or as we hope. So I'm finding it's helpful to add adjectives, and that already happened a little bit today. Joanne offered us defiant hope. I like resilient hope and wide-eyed hope and stubborn hope. And I do invite you to think, what are the adjectives of your hope and the hope that you want to build into your life? And last, Richard Rohr writes, and I found this 2 years ago, I found this in a daily meditation from Richard Rohr that I hold on to, and it says, hope is not primarily for the future, it's for now. Hope is a way of seeing time and understanding the present. It's a way of tasting and receiving the moment. It gives us capacity to enter into the future in a new way. Hope sees all the alternatives. It recognizes and creates an alternative consciousness. That is the hope of a prophet. We also have a really great hymn, There's a Wild Hope in the Wind, which is in Voices Together, 828, if you're looking for a hope song to share with your congregation. 828 in Voices Together, but I won't read that now. So our closing comments are these. We'll see you on March 5th at 10 a.m. Central Time. We'll be sending that link out, and there will be some other communication with you between now and then. First, you're welcome to send us any thoughts, questions, comments that you have, or to start conversations with each other. Please feel free to do that. Talk to each other. We will let you know who the speaker is and the topic of our March gathering as soon as we have that nailed down. And I'll also be sending around a few things, the recording from today in case you missed any part of it, Doug's PowerPoint slides from his presentation, the text from our chat storm, and a few other resources, including some resources on lament. I heard, Dan, you were asking about that, and a few other things that Tim linked or showed in his presentation. So is there anything else you want from us in the month that you know right now you want to request? Or if not,
Could I just make a suggestion? And this
Yeah,
is
for sure.
working on Murray's idea.
Mhm.
Both of us work in AI. I would strongly encourage each of us to take our projects, write up as much as you can, and then run it through AI, because it gives some really interesting additional questions or comments when you're running this. Because we often spend a lot of time trying to make these ideas work. And it's amazing how AI can really help add as a tool. So I just strongly encourage you to think about that.
Do you have a specific AI tool that you would recommend that feels trustworthy, and why?
Yeah, ChatGPT AI is you can buy you can use a free version. It does limit you up to, I think, 3 attachments. You can get really smart about it. You just instead of putting the attachments in, just put the entire text into the request. I just asked for how to do create our solar panel for campus Sinaboya. And the ideas it did for each of the questions was amazing. Like I had some cool ideas, but didn't think about outside of the box, and it does help you do that. Murray, anything to add to that?
We can hear you.
No. Thanks for that comment.
All right. All right. Well, we'll close with gratitude. Thank you for being here, for all of you for contributing and bringing your heart and your passion and your concern and your willingness to enter into community together. So blessings. Thank you to Dan and Doug and Tim for your input, and all of you for sharing from the heart. And we ask now that the Spirit of life be present with us as we move from here, and that the Spirit of life would move among us in our work and in our communities and in our church. Go and be well.